Hey everyone, this is Jacob Garcia, and welcome back to another episode of the Reason Through podcast, a show dedicated to having charitable, philosophical conversations and to help you, the listener, reason through your views. In this episode, I speak with Dr. Chad Bogosian. We discuss the current status of morals and ethics. We also discuss subjectivism, objectivism, nihilism, and the relationship between fact and value. So, without further ado, I bring you Dr. Chad Bogosian. Okay, so with me I have Dr. Chad Bogosian. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So before we get started on our topic, if you don't mind kind of telling our listeners who you are and what you do.
Yeah, uh, I teach full time philosophy as a philosophy instructor, Clovis Community College in Clovis, California, which is in the greater Fresno area. I've been teaching philosophy at the college level for about 12 years, and there's a whole lot that I guess could be said there, but I love that I get to teach philosophy. I was drawn into philosophy through a combination of doing an undergraduate degree in counseling psychology and then religious studies and theology. And it was really the topics of ethics and kind of topics at the intersection of philosophy of the human person, ethics, and religion that drew me into philosophy. So questions like the nature of right and wrong, I think, which we'll talk a little bit about today, and whether or not God exists, the problem of evil, is there any rational plausibility to believing in an afterlife, these kinds of the meaning of life, these kinds of ultimate questions. And so I love that I get to be in a classroom under normal circumstances, I would say, engaging students on these topics and getting just to kind of grapple with why people think what they think, and even the kind of practical implications for
Mhm.
how we think about these things inform how we live and treat one another and these kinds of things.
When you were younger too, it was you're kind of the main catalyst, like, would you say then, or would you say like you were kind of when you, even before kind of your undergrad, like you kind of started having these like thinking about philosophy in this way, or kind of just
Yeah.
having this kind of yearning, right? Because like for me, it was I guess I've always thought a little deeply about things, but never really about. I didn't start taking like nonfiction or like philosophy seriously until about like 5 years ago, where I'm like, okay, like this is something that I think I really love and I'm passionate about. But then it's kind of like, well, uh, like it was a gradual thing. It just wasn't like I know some people that like, oh yeah, back when I was in high school, I started studying all these things, and so.
Yeah, great. No, yeah, for me, some of this is a lot of this is reflective of my own kind of journey and upbringing, which is too long for today, probably. But I wasn't aware of what philosophy, what it was, or even, I probably heard the term maybe in high school. But
Mhm.
looking back now on reflection, I think it makes a lot of sense. I would say uh, a key point in high school. I mean, I was always a questioner, and I always uh, asked questions. My parents encouraged that. I think one of the things they did really well was they encouraged, challenging things, even that were taught in the household. Um, and so we had many dinner conversations. Where myself or my siblings were asking, questions related to, you know, God and religion and morality and
Mhm.
politics and
Mhm.
this sort of thing. But I think a key point for me was in high school. I took a debate class,
Mm.
and I took that because it sounded interesting. My parents and others had kind of picked up that I had this knack for arguing, and that was in my younger years was probably not a good. It was probably more antagonistic.
Yep. Sure.
I was immature and this sort of thing. But I mean, there was some just honest seeking, I think, in there too. uh, you know, my mom likes to give me a hard time that,
Mm.
because we were regular churchgoers, and
Mhm.
in the junior high, I was almost kicked out of youth group
Oh
because
wow.
I was asking, I was asking a lot of questions, and I wouldn't, I kind of had a, crap detector, and I didn't
Mhm.
take kind of pat answers.
Mhm.
And again, I was immature, and so I was challenging the kind of pat things that people wanted me to sign off on, and that
Yep.
created a little bit of a problem.
Mhm.
And so it was kind of like, you got to get your son in order here, or else,
Mm, mhm.
But anyways, it was kind of that, and then I think the debate class where I was being kind of freed up to argue,
Yeah.
and but I was being pushed to have to develop arguments and not just
Yeah.
vent, like a view.
Mhm.
And my teacher in that class actually made me defend a side of an ethics issue that he knew I didn't hold.
Mm.
It was purposeful, and initially made me mad. But then my mom's response was, "Well, look, like this is a great opportunity for you to learn to defend both sides. And we're going to go to the library, which is what we did in those days. Went down to the public library, and we got books on and articles on both sides of this. Uh, the issue was surrogacy. That was kind of a hot button issue in
Mhm.
the, I don't know what that was, would have been the late '80s, early '90s.
Okay.
And so, and again, I couldn't tell you all the ins and outs of why it was one place or another, but he just
Mhm.
kind of sensed that I had one view, and so he made me defend that, and I ended up winning the debate,
Oh, wow.
and I got an A in the class, and so from there, I kind of had this interest. And again, I didn't know it as philosophy, but my dad started encouraging me to consider a law kind of profession, because my parents saw that I had this knack for kind of rational thought and
Mhm.
argumentation.
Mhm.
And I did consider that for a time, but I think it was more of a slow process where, and again, reflective of my upbringing. I think philosophy, as maybe we'll talk about today, was not seen in a positive light. It was probably seen as, a threat in certain ways
Mhm.
to religious thinking or something.
Yeah.
But I think, in your sense, that I would say my family has come to understand that that's an incorrect assumption,
Mhm.
given my own journey. And
Mhm.
yeah, so that's kind of how I evolved into it. And then in college, I think it took off more with a world religions
Mhm.
class, and
Mhm.
an ethics class, and an intro to philosophy class, and then I started going, oh, this is how I'm wired, and
Yeah.
these are the kinds of, I like to ask the questions the ways philosophers are asking them, and so it just kind of went from there.
Yeah. No, and that's kind of feel like a little bit that's a little bit my journey too. At least definitely, and I've always said this. I said this to my wife about you, and I think I said this to one of my guests yesterday. But just it was like so prior to my being in your class, I read a little bit of nonfiction, a little bit of what some people were saying, but I also have like that kind of I wasn't taking either the other side seriously, or so for like just me being like right, kind of non-theist or kind of more leaning towards agnosticism to atheism, just not taking it seriously, and or at least theism seriously in some regards, and just kind of looking down on it, or and just certain views that I held, not just towards theism, but just towards certain other views where I just that or like for example it's not good enough, at least my from my perspective, right? It's not good enough to say that that view is absurd, right?
Yeah,
You have to
right.
give kind of your reasons for why it is absurd, and kind of demonstrate either through argumentation or through some type of evidential way, right, to show like this isn't the correct view or model that we should be using, or kind of gearing towards, whatever the case may be. And I would say, and I still hold to this day, that when I was the first time I was in your class, in your intro to philosophy, I was like, man, I really like talking to Dr. Bogosian. He helped me see like just he's always been very fair to views, whatever the spectrum may be, even of views that I don't think he holds, but just
I
even if
appreciate that. Yeah.
yeah, and something that I would say, I'm like, man, like he's really fair about this, and that was like an opening of a door, right, to kind of taking more things seriously, and kind of taking philosophy a little bit more seriously in some regard. And so that's something I've taken with me and appreciate a lot.
Oh, great, man. I appreciate you sharing that. And I think, as I've said to you before, I think this kind of show or podcast is a great way to, I think, model that and bring others into that, because I'm convinced, not everyone agrees with me on this, but I'm convinced that a lot of people, whether or not they've had a philosophy class or read philosophy, really do desire and even crave, um, a forum where either they can engage others this way
Mhm.
and really think about the other side in these non-dismissive, emotionally charged ways, or they want to believe that there are people who could do that and do that together. And so
Mhm.
I think this is great, and I hope uh, I'm confident that, that your interactions with the guests will do that, and I think people will really benefit from it. So
Yeah, I certainly hope so too. So I think this is a good segue into kind of our topic, which is kind of the
yeah.
nature about kind of good and evil, right and wrong. Are these objective? Is it subjective? Or I think there are two different branches, right? So you kind of have like the moral, I guess, realist in some regard, or objectivist, or and the moral skeptics. I think that's how it's been traditionally kind of defined within literature.
Yeah. So, uh, and if, feel free to jump in or, pause me or ask questions at any point. Yeah, I think the way I like to kind of set this up, and I know we're going to today, if I understand kind of our, some of our goals, we're going to be covering a fair bit of ground in a short amount of time. And I want to just say, for starters, for anyone who might be listening, that's intentional. We understand we're going to be painting with some broad, strokes, and maybe at some point we can drill a little deeper. So yeah, let me just say from the get go, there are kind of two what I like to call families of views in terms of how to think about good and evil, or right and wrong, or morality, ethics, if you will. And the two families are broadly, I'm going to call it moral objectivism. And I might say something later if there's time for those who might be listening and you're more accustomed to hearing this carved up as absolutism and relativism. Uh, I have my own reasons for not doing it that way, and it's not commonly done that way among philosophers. Those are important terms that we'll get to. But objectivism, I think, is a broader category that can include absolutism,
Mhm.
but those things can come apart. So, real generally, moral objectivism is a family of views or a kind of view where an individual, you said realism, moral realism, that's one of our fancy philosophy terms. But moral objectivism, moral realism, those are interchangeable. And that's the idea that just like there's a natural world, right, that's not of my making or United Americans making, we go out there and we find it, we uncover it and discover it through our ways, methods of inquiry. Morality is part of that order of things, right? There's either a moral order or a moral domain or a moral law, or those, that language all indicates that independent of my head, right, my person, and independent of our cultural uh, consensus or agreement or beliefs, there's some order out there that we're trying to discover and then live in light of. That's objectivism. And within that family, there are lots of members, as we'll see. Just like within my family, there are lots of members, and so there are lots of ways to be an objectivist. But generally, they all agree on that general kind of definition or description. On the other side, you have a family of views called moral skepticism. And moral skepticism is a general view that denies, they all deny that there's an objective moral domain that's binding for all people, places, and times, that's discoverable by all humans, and, at least in principle, in all places and times. And so what they can reject that, but then the question becomes, well, what do you do with morality if it's not objective? And so the skepticism is that they deny that there's this objectivity, and they might also deny that morality is knowable, and we can get into that. So those can overlap, but they're not exactly the same thing. Now, skepticism, if I can say this here, skepticism comes in multiple varieties, just like objectivism does, and then we're going to kind of unpack some of those today. But what's really important there is that you understand that maybe you've heard a friend say, well, morality is just a matter of that's your opinion, and I have a different one, and the people across the pond have a different one. Usually what's being kind of presented there, or maybe even smuggled in, is some kind of skepticism. Morality isn't anything more than the opinion I hold or the opinion you hold. There's nothing independent of those opinions to kind of uh, that's the final say or leveler of, well, Jacob's opinion's the true one and Chad's opinion is the false one. They're just opinions kind of all the way down, so to speak. And so we can explore in more depth how a person comes to that. But those are the two general types of views.
we can move on to kind of diving more deeper into moral skepticism. And this is something that maybe it's just from my from my background, it was kind of a little weird shift to where so I grew up in the church, and but I never really thought like we'll get into this too about kind of divine command theory and how that's kind of typically associated with kind of moral objectivism. But as soon as I started, but maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, I did have this thought of subjectivism. Well, it is subjective in the sense that, and what I think people mean by subjective, and I kind of want to know what you think about when you're engaging in ethics class with your students. If you typically kind of hear a lot of them either talk about kind of the three branches would be, or what we would talk about for more skepticism, meaning nihilism, emotivism, and subjectivism. But it seems to me like with subjectivism, it comes down to, well, if there is no God, then we are kind of coming up with our own. We're constructing our own morality, right? There's nothing external from humans that is impeding either morality upon us, or there's nothing external of that. And in the natural world, if there is no God, we have these psychological preferences, and these preferences are constructed through how we want to live our lives in some way. Um, so is that something that's familiar? Is that am I leaning? Is that sounds like subjectivism, or is that kind of more? Am I conflating between subjectivism and emotivism here? Or
Yeah, so let me just make one quick clarification. So within skeptical views, among skeptical views, there is nihilism, and emotivism is a kind of nihilism, and we can go back to that in a second after we hit subjectivism. Subjectivism is the second kind of skeptical view, which says that morality is based on, you hit it really good. Morality, its ultimate basis is an individual, my preferences, beliefs, feelings, psychological, like you said, dispositions, etc. So it's based on, it's kind of per individual. The third kind of skepticism is moral relativism, sociocultural relativism. So nihilism, there are multiple kinds of nihilism. Emotivism is one of those. Then you've got subjectivism and relativism. Relativism now is like subjectivism, except it just kind of, what I like to say is, expands the circle. So both of these views believe there is morality exists in some weaker sense. It either exists based in kind of individual preferences for the subjectivist, for the relativist, moral relativist, cultural relativist. Cultures are constructing it. That's a good word. That I like that word that you use. So morality is a construct, either individually or uh, dependent upon a group. So let's go back to subjectivism. I think you're right. The one common reason uh, I've read, and I think particularly just at the grassroots kind of class level, a lot of students are like yourself, although I don't think they would have to be a non-theist to say what you said. Um, I do think, though, that people often, whether they're theists or non-theists, would think, well, goodness, if morality isn't objective, and maybe to be objective, you got to have God or a higher power or a cosmic force or something like this, right? That's independent of human beings. That is the ultimate basis of murder being wrong, or uh, justice being good, or something like this. Well, then once you take that out of the picture, what are you left with? Well, you're left with, like you said, the natural world, and natural world stuff is a different kind of stuff than morality. And so, well, how do you go at it from there? Well, you start with something in the natural world, and a really likely candidate is me, right? So, or you, and so you you might say, well, hey, if I'm going to party during COVID, that's right for me, and maybe Chad says, no, I'm not doing that. That's too risky. That's wrong for me. Okay, great. We both win. And and so it's hard, I think, for people to see, well, let's suppose now we're talking about whether you and I are going to get together for the holidays. Well, who's to say what's right now? Because now each of our individual risk levels and what you think is right and I think is right about how we behave in COVID is coming into conflict. Now we've got a problem, right? We've got a tension. And if you've taken God out of the picture to sort of resolve the dispute, now the question is, well, what do you do with that? And so I think there is a natural or a very common disposition with students, I find that uh, once you take God out of the, let's say, or something in that transcends human beings and culture out of the picture, individuals are a likely the maybe the most likely candidate
Mhm.
for how you get morality.
Mhm.
And we can press on this a little bit more as we go. But then, as I indicated, I think one common tension is what happens when individual
Mhm.
preferences come into conflict, and they do every day, right? In my
Mhm.
own house, they do, and I'm guessing in your household
Yeah.
too. But then, even like in my classroom, right, end of term, I've got one student that says, "Well, hey, yeah, I know I didn't turn in the work, but I really need this particular grade on my transcript." And then I got another student who says, "Well, look, I turned in all the work, and so I earned the grade." And then what do I do with that? I've got two preferences coming into conflict. Well, I got to have some way of resolving that. And so
Mhm.
we can explore whether subjectivism can handle
So
that. But yeah, go ahead. Put,
what I'm thinking too, and something like, so I no longer really hold this position. My views I think have definitely changed and more become a little bit more nuanced. But when I held this position, at least with like this kind of subjectivism, there seems to be, at least from what I also hear either from students within the classroom when I was a student, and kind of online, is that they seem to have. I think there's two things. One is that. I don't think it's them. I think it has to do with our inquiry, scientific inquiry, in the sense that, like when we're studying the natural world, like we don't find values there, right? You just find these facts, like what is and what is. This is the case. This is the case. You're not finding what either you ought to do or the kind of value of maybe I shouldn't do that, or I. So there seems to be kind of that relationship with subjectivism, but I also think there's another relationship with the subjectivism, is that I don't. I can see someone saying, who is a subjectivist, saying, I don't have to value what you value, and because I don't have to value that, let's say I just don't value that the government should not be infringing upon imposing its will upon citizens. There we go. Right. So I value that. Well, when you're engaging with someone who says that, no, we should have a government kind of impinging certain freedoms upon and restricting our rights, if I'm picking and choosing what I'm valuing, that it then follows that morality or my values are subjective because I'm choosing to hold this position. And there's nothing external or imposing any will upon me to have me to make me have this value. Is that something that's something on the lines that, like, back when if I put myself back into subjectivist shoes, like that's something that I definitely see, like this conflation between at least what I would call moral internalism, right? You have to have some type of internal motivation to do a certain action.
okay, so yeah, let me actually hearing you say all that remind me of something
Okay.
that you triggered in something earlier that I think is a really important distinction here. Uh, in that, yes, I think that's a common way of how people kind of rationalize their subjectivist view or kind of pull. But I think there are a couple problems with that. Okay, of that sort of rationale. And one, I think to start, there's an important distinction. I think there's no denying. I mean, objectivists are going to agree that sure. I mean, subjects hold views, right? Subjects have opinions. Uh, you know, if I believe that, and I do, that racism is wrong and evil, well, I, Chad Bogosian, the individual subject, hold that belief to be true. But it doesn't follow from that. My holding it to be true doesn't make it true or false, right? Nor does it make it, nor does it make, imply that racism is in fact evil or not evil, whether I hold one thing or value it or not, right? Let's say, or hold it as a problem. So I think there's an important distinction here to be made between a person's holding something, right, or valuing something in a kind of personal sense. And I would say when they're probably using the word value there in a slippery way. What they really mean is I don't believe the government should be doing it, or I do believe the government should be doing it in your example. But again, beliefs, there's a difference between believing something, that would be an opinion, and whether that belief is true. And in nearly no other domain do we think that merely believing something makes it true. I'm alarmed, to be honest, with people who are talking that way in our current all the things we currently disagree about, whether it's related to COVID or whether it's related to government actions or whether it's related to morality or, okay, just believing something. If I believe that 2 + 2 is 5, that's not sufficient to make it 5, right? I've got to have something to point to its truthfulness, right? I need evidence, as you said. And so in the moral domain, I think it doesn't follow from, right, as you said, it doesn't follow from my valuing something that it's in fact valuable, right? It might be valuable for one, but there still is a real question that's a separate question is, is this a value that should be held, excuse me, by others, not just me? And that's the normative question, as we call it, right? That's the would provide the motivational force to change my view or to act differently if it's in fact valuable. Now, I understand there's a debate here between the subjectivist and the non-subjectivist, but I think what there is a conflation, or they're trying to shrink down, right? The second question I said there, which is the question of whether or not government intervention is something that ought to be valued, just to I value it, so that's all that can be said. And I think those need to be pulled apart. I don't think that those are one and the same question. And I think, does that make sense? Am I being clear there?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think I understand the distinction. I mean,
Let me use an analogy. So there's a difference between, and again, this is, so if I go to my doctor and I say, well, look, well, yeah, I've got COVID symptoms and the test came back positive, but I just don't think I need to, I just don't think I need to take what you're telling me to take to get well. And I don't think I need to quarantine for 14 days. Well, the fact that I don't value the doctor's judgments, right, isn't sufficient to show that I ought not to value it. Now, of course, I'm free in some broad sense to not value it and to make
mhm,
my own choices, but it doesn't follow from my believing that they're wrong, that they are in fact wrong, or that follow from my having a different value structure. Let's say medically, and I don't even think you have to bring in the expertise issue. Of course, I think we could bring that in,
mhm,
but let's suppose, I mean, if you want to build the case, like, let's suppose we have we went to the same med school and I just disagree. Now, again, that could be construed a different way, but I'm just trying to draw an analogy here with the valuing something by itself. The fact that I value it doesn't do enough work, right? It doesn't provide sufficient evidence that the value either is in fact valuable or not valuable. I
mhm,
need something else there. And I think one way we can show that is when values come into conflict. Your initial example here with government intervention is a good one. Sure, people can disagree. I think rational people can disagree here. But we want to go further than the disagreement. We want to know, could we in principle resolve the disagreement? And especially because people's livelihoods are at stake, social cohesion is at stake, social flourishing is at stake, and so it's a high stakes game. And just kind
mhm,
of retreating to my value versus your value is not going to kind of treat the stakes appropriately. Does that make sense?
mhm.
And so I don't think it follows at all from someone holding some view, whether it's morality or medicine or anything, that that's all that can be said about it. I think you know I think we have lots of examples
Mhm,
where we need more than just the subjective holding of a belief
mhm.
to indicate that that belief uh, is worth being held. Does that press on that a little bit if I'm
No,
not being as
I
clear as
think
I
you're
think
being
I'm being?
no, I think you're being that sounds clear to me, at least, from my point of view. It kind of reminds me a little bit of, I mean, so you can take the value aspect out of it, right? When it comes to like a fact of the matter, like if there's certain facts about whatever X. Um, Now, whether I believe X is true and X is false, like I can hold that X is false, even though X is true. Um, And so it seems as if like that can still be resolved because it's like, well, you're just like we can just say, well, like, you're just wrong with that. And that's kind of like how I'm interpreting what you're saying, where it's like, okay, you can have the subject saying like that's not true or I don't value that, and like the individual can in principle hold those positions and kind of have that either disposition or whatever the case may be. But it doesn't have any my believing in something. So like my believing that I'm having a conversation is independent of that. At least I think that's kind of how I'm
Yeah.
interpreting it. Like there's, yeah.
Well, let me, if I can say one more quick thing about. So you mentioned the fact value distinction, and that's a big topic on its own. But
Yeah.
this is my view now, and like everything in philosophy, there are people smart or even smarter people than myself that would disagree with me on this. But I'm not sure that I think maybe part of the problem here is with that distinction. I think something can both be a fact and a value. I think pulling those apart, uh, to pull those apart, a person needs a further commitment than just subjectivism to
Mm,
a particular kind of view of not only reality, but particularly how we know what we know. And so I'm not convinced that the only way we know the world is through the scientific method, so to speak. And so I think there's a kind of scientism that's being, or a hard empiricism at least, that's being
mm, mhm,
that's driving the view. And I'm pro science and I'm pro empirical methods and all the rest of it. But I think we can know the world, ourselves in the world, through reason, and that's not necessarily something that's testable, reproducible in the proper sense of the term. And so something could be a fact. So if murder is wrong, and I believe it is, I believe that's a moral fact, but it's also it's connected to a value, namely the value of human life, right?
mhm,
The good of human life. And so um, even if some murder's wrongness isn't, let's say, determinable or discoverable by the scientific method in the strict sense of how that's typically
mhm.
used, or worked with. Again, I don't think it follows that there aren't moral facts, right? And I know I'd have to argue for that too, and
Yeah,
I'd
for
be
sure.
happy to attempt that. But I just want to make kind of a conceptual point there that I think
Mhm,
something can be both values and facts. And I think even people who might disagree with some of my commitments on the knowledge issue, like Sam Harris, for example, would.
mhm,
I think where we would agree is that um, we can know the world. I think from what the stuff I've read of his and even watched with him, I think he, in some ways, would accept the claim that we can know through reason. I mean, I think he
mhm,
has a stronger view about the scientific method than I
mhm,
would, but um, and what it can give us on moral questions.
mhm,
But I think he would agree that things can be both facts and values. So without deviating too much on his view, like, if what makes something objectively right or wrong has to do with its promoting of the positive states of well-being for conscious creatures or however he says that.
mhm.
Well, that's determined in part by the scientific method, but some of it's going to be, as far as I understand it, I don't think you can totally avoid that. Some of that's going to be by observing your experience of other human beings, right? So kind of drawn from lived experience, shared experience together, and then rationally evaluating or extrapolating from those experiences, you know, what's actually promoting those states or not promoting those states,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And so some of that's going to come from the hard and soft sciences, but some of that's going to, I think, going to come just from shared experience.
yeah.
Um, and maybe I'm wrong about what he would say there, but I think I think there could be some agreement, and I think that's really important to point out because uh, sorry, jump in there. I lost my train of thought real
Yeah,
quick there. So
so no, I agree that, so for example, like I definitely like I don't hold the position of like scientism, because I agree. I think hard empiricism, or just like hard naturalism, as I would describe it, is kind of, at least to some degree, kind of question begging. Um, but there's also, so Hilary Putnam has a book called The Fact Value Dichotomy. And so I
yes,
also kind of think it has to do with, and so really interesting book, pretty dense, but it reminds me a little bit of how fact and value kind of are being treated within our educational system in general, to where values are opinions. It's kind of ingrained, right, a little bit, where values
yes,
are opinions, and everything that, and then if it's not an opinion, it would be a fact, and facts are not opinions. You can't have, but you can have
yes,
it seems like you can have an opinion that is a fact as well. But my main point is that what Hillary Putnam was saying, and what Sam Harris, I think they both, what we all kind of agree on, is that like I think Sam Harris would say, like fact and value are kind of like the two, like you have a coin, right? It's just one side of the other coin, where they're tied together. So I think Sam has said something like what if someone doesn't value truth, then what are you gonna, or if someone doesn't value evidence, like what evidence are you gonna bring them so that they understand what your like your point or whatever the case may be. Um, where Hillary Putnam, and I agree with this one, is that in our scientific inquiry about, there are certain foundational values about what makes a good scientific model. Its explanatory scope, its parsimony, it's kind of the amount of necessary assumptions that need to be made. Like all those are values, as opposed to you can have another model that just, of course, I can come up with a model that's just completely ridiculous, but um, that can explain data, the data that we're seeing, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be true, and why we should prefer something that has parsimony or it has explanatory scope and that has this predictive power. Like those are values that we have within our scientific model that it's predicated on. And so like you can't pull them apart to say, well, this is a fact and this is all we're going to
Mhm.
need. You have to have the value behind that fact. At least that's kind of my current position on that a little bit.
Yeah, no, I like that, and I appreciate you sharing that. I think maybe just one thing I'd add here for how I think about it. Again, I'm not trying to. I want to be clear that I'm not trying to say that facts and values are the same
Right.
kinds of
Yeah. Yeah.
things per se, but a value statement, as I understand it, is one that is using the language of goodness, right? The category of something as good, right? And that's how we kind of use it. I think a lot in moral philosophy. And so if I get the focus off myself for a second, just say something like, you know, human life has a measurable worth, right? So goodness or worth, that's value talk. Well, now the question becomes, can a statement about the immeasurable worth of a human being, can that be true? Now we're in fact territory. So we're just taking value statements
Hmm.
and judgments and asking if they can be true or false. Objectivists, by and large, are going to say, yeah, you can have both of those. I think when you start pulling apart fact and value, not just to distinguish them, but to say that, like you said, and I agree with you. I'll come back to maybe say something about the school thing. I do think, even unintentionally, to be as charitable as I can.
Right.
I see this in my son's, first grade right now, and what he's being asked to write. And I'll use that example in a second. But yeah, I think there are facts, and then there are opinions, and things that are opinions are often talked about as just an opinion, and there's no overlap, and that's a false dichotomy. The philosopher Justin McBrayer wrote a really neat uh, popular piece in the New York Times, an op-ed a number of years ago, and the title is "Why Our Children Don't Believe There Are Moral Facts," or something like this, and you can find that by Googling it. But he basically says what you're saying is that it starts in education, unintentionally. Where the intention is to give kids categories to parse up stuff, and that's good. But the unintended blowback is that all of a sudden they start going, well, there are these fact things, and that's, math and science and technology. But then over here you got morality and religion and politics, and that's not in fact, can't be in fact
Hmm.
territory.
Hmm.
But in reality, right, those can overlap. At least the argument goes, because if a moral claim is either true or false, well, then if it's true, it's in fact territory, right?
Hmm.
And same for a political. Maybe the
Hmm.
government should have more involvement or less involvement. So there's a truth there. And once we, let's say, have good reasons to believe it's true, well, then it's in fact territory. And so, when my son came home this semester and had been given an assignment, well, I would call it a critical thinking assignment, but it was sort of like they have a more age appropriate name for it. But he had to like write an opinion piece, but he had to give reasons for his opinion. And
Hmm.
so initially he said, well, and so we were talking at dinner, and it came up, well, that's your opinion, Dad. And I said, well, and it was something about right and wrong. And I said, well, is it just an opinion, my opinion? Well, he thought for a second, but then I
Hmm.
was pleased to discover that the teacher had basically said, well, something can start out as an opinion,
Hmm.
but if you back it up with reasons, it could be a candidate
Hmm.
for. But I wanted to be very clear, at least
Hmm.
in my parenting of him, that sure, well, that's an opinion, but if you give salient reasons for it, I didn't use that word with him, but good reasons for your view, then it's a
Hmm.
candidate for also being a fact. And so I think it's really important. What I'd like to see is that we help people
Hmm.
Yes, distinguish them in an important sense, but see that there can be some overlap there too. Because I think morality, uh, our moral lives are kind of hinging on that
Hmm.
overlap.
And
Anyways,
that's where at least some people, they will, I think this is where I think you get into kind of nihilism and emotivism to where you still have people like, no, 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 no. Like, no, it's an opinion. It's just either predicated on my emotion or there is no value, right? So like going back to the natural world where you don't see the value there, which I would think leads people to kind of this like a nihilistic kind of view about
yeah.
everything, that there is no value, and that it is still kind of constructed. And so if you want to kind of talk about nihilism and then how it kind of is intertwined a little bit with emotivism.
So just to reflect that back, you want me to? The question is about how nihilism and emotivism are connected. If
Mhm.
you,
And just kind of flesh out what is nihilism, how would you kind of define it, and kind
I
of
see.
in a very broad sense.
Yeah. So nihilism as a type of view is the view that that morality is non-existent. Okay. So we might talk in moral language and we might express moral judgments, but at the end of the day, it's an empty category. And so, by analogy, people who are nihilists about the meaning of life, you can talk about meaning and meaningful activity all you want, but at the end of the day, either uh, all those statements are false about meaning, or you're just expressing some emotions, but it doesn't really hook up to anything outside of my emotional state. So morality is like that. Morality, the two most common kinds of nihilism are what's called emotivism, right? Moral statements are just expressions of approval or disapproval, like or dislike. One philosopher called it the boo hiss theory. Emotivism is like, hooray for social justice, boo for racism, right? But those are like affective expressions of affective states internal to me that have no cognitive, rational content to them. So they're not candidates for true or false beliefs. They're just you're kind of emotionally venting
Yeah.
either a strong aversion to something or strong approval of something. So that's emotivism. The
So
second most,
just to
sorry, yeah, go ahead.
kind of clarify just for people. So it's kind of like I stub my toe or something like that. And I'm like, ow, right? So that me saying ow as a reaction to feeling pain, or a minor pain, wherever the case may be, that has no truth value, right? I'm just expressing what I'm currently physically feeling, and that's not true or false. It's just kind of an expression, and that's how emotivists would say that's exactly how. When we speak of good and wrong, or right and wrong, and what we should and should not do, that's exactly what we're doing. We're expressing those kinds of similar
Yeah.
emotions where they're not truth apt. They are just that expression of our physical states.
Yeah, well said. I mean, and just to be clear for our psychology friends out there, yes, our emotions are real. So we're not denying that emotions are real states, right? So yes, they're true in a very small t sense, right? Relative to the person. So we're not denying the reality of emotions. That's not the goal here. The important difference is that they don't have uh, they don't have this, and I said cognitive content. By cognitive we mean they're not what you said, Jacob, which is claims about a world, right, a mind independent world that is true or false, so we can kind of have reasons to believe that those statements reflect the world outside of my own kind of psychological states. And so that's what's being said there, number one. And number two, um, expressions of like stubbing your toe, right? Express You can express emotions all you want, but you're expressing that your toe hurts doesn't give me any kind of reason for doing anything about your toe, right? I don't have to treat you any particular way because your toe hurts, unless maybe I'm a doctor in an ER or something, right? But I don't have any sort of ought there, right? There isn't any sort of normative statement of what I ought to do or not do in relation to how you feel. And so if you want to say that, well, now you're jumping ship on nihilism, because nihilism is saying all we're doing, at least emotivism is saying all we're doing when we say murder is wrong, or equality is good is we're just doing the equivalent of, ow, that hurts, I don't like the pain, or oh, that feels really great, I love the sunset, or something. And so that's the emotivism. Yeah, the second most common type of nihilism is called error theory. Error theory uh, would say, sure, people make moral statements all the time, but they're all equivalent and they're all equally false. So murder is right, murder is wrong. Both statements are equally false. So you can't have there's no moral truth. You can have moral statements, but they just don't hook up to reality in any way. And that would just be like saying, you know, all mathematical statements, right? No matter what you say is false by definition. Now, let me just really quickly, to be fair to the nihilist, maybe give a couple reasons why a person might take either of those routes as a nihilist. Um, so we just kind of described the view, but why might a person be attracted to this? Well, a couple common things have come up in our discussion already. One is uh, morality is it doesn't work within a certain kind of scientific viewpoint, right? It's um, uh, you know, maybe a politically one philosopher called it the queerness theory, and that might be politically incorrect for some people, but all that he meant there was it's odd, right? It's different. It doesn't fit within this really naturalistic physicalist view of the world where we've got atoms and we've got particles and we've got laws that operate on them. And so if we can't fit it in there, right? If that's just a square peg in a round hole, well, then we chuck it if it doesn't fit within that viewpoint. And so a lot of nihilists say, well, look, that's what morality is like, right? As you mentioned earlier, Jacob, is that, you know, I don't see how we can taste it, touch it, reproduce it in a lab and see it under a microscope. And so it's not real. That's a common one. Another one goes back to something else you said, Jacob, which has to do with maybe the what, if any, connection there is between morality and God. Once you take God out of the picture, and I had a colleague like this in grad school at one point. I shared an office with this person, and they wrote a master's thesis saying, well, once you get rid of God, which this person had, this person was convinced that that just entails nihilism, and of course, um, I think that's mistaken, and a lot of other people, whether they're theists or not theists, would think that's not correct. But people debate whether that was Nietzsche's view or other people's view that if God is dead, right? Well, now all of a sudden you've knocked out any footing for morality, and so that would be another reason to be a nihilist. Maybe a third. Let's see if I think I got one other one here. Let me leave it at that. I'll let you jump in there, and we can talk about pushbacks to that. But does that make sense there as far as why someone might be motivated to be a nihilist?
Yeah,
You
no,
want to
totally.
add anything in there?
Yeah, no. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. Because as far as like Mackey's kind of like his argument, it's
Yeah.
the argument from queerness.
Right. Right.
What I was going to say is that it is something like that, right? To where, like, I wouldn't go as far as say like morality is just so different. But when you're kind of okay, when we're interacting with the external world, it's like, well, what are we seeing, right? So, like for example, um, when it's wet outside, if I look at a blade of grass, or you look at the grass, whatever the case may be, you can look at the grass, but it also has water on it, right? Because it's wet. So we would probably say like, okay, so the grass has a certain property kind of supervened upon it, which is this water the property of water is on it, and we can see that, and we can create a model of how that works and how all that kind of fits together. And someone I think who would hold a position of either nihilism or emotivism would say the same thing, to where it's like, well, we don't see that with morality. Like
Yeah.
what we're seeing is, so maybe if I see a person, getting hurt, or if I see like my daughter, someone being unfair to my daughter, but what I'm saying it's unfair, but what am I seeing? What is the property or whatever that's supervening upon these sets of kind of actions that is making it unfair? And what it seems as if both the nihilist or the motivist might say, or subjectivist might say, is like, well, the reason why it's like this is maybe because a motivist might just say, well, it's because, I'm having this psychological aversion to what's being done to someone that's a part of my species, right? Or someone that's a part of my kin.
Right.
And that's what it is. It's a sociobiological kind of story that I have the connection with my daughter. And what I'm
Yeah.
really upset about is, or I'm just having this visceral anger. And that's what's really going on. It's not that there's actually something independent of my mind that is supervening upon uh, the the facts of the matter. Um, they really, I think, mean when they're talking about emotivism, like what they're kind of how they're saying it.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, if there's anything else we want to say about kind of moral skepticism, and then we can move on to kind of objectivism a little bit. Um,
Yeah, so let me just make a couple quick, these are quick, and again, in the interest of time, a couple quick rebuttals maybe a non-nihilist might give is that to those two things that I'm kinds of arguments I mentioned is that, let's suppose we make, one thing they like to highlight in the error theory is missteps in our moral judgments, right? We've got the Pol Pots of the world and the Hitlers of the world, or the Atlantic slave trade, and human history is littered with moral missteps, right, where we've gotten it wrong. And so some nihilists will say this is good evidence that moral talk is just something that's come constructed, right, within the human species to kind of power over other people and uh, use them for whatever ends we selfishly have in mind or whatever. And I think a one common pushback to that by non-nihilists is that errors in more, in judgment or errors in action uh, of any kind is not sufficient to indicate that there isn't a truth on whatever the topic is, right? Scientists have made errors. Uh, you know, we can go down the track there. We as humans are fallible, right? We sometimes get things wrong in terms of our inquiry, but that's consistent with there being an objective truth to the matter that we're trying to get to, and it's precisely we
mhm,
need that objective truth to be able to now in retrospect correct ourselves and move closer to it, whether we're talking about science or whether we're talking about morality. So as it's going to turn
mhm,
out, says the objectivist, uh, objectivism actually does a better job and
mhm,
provides more explanatory power for not only explaining the error but in correcting the error, giving us something to correct towards. Whereas with
mhm.
nihilism, you're basically giving up the game, and we don't do that in other domains like science, which nihilists typically prize, and so we shouldn't therefore do that in in morality. So I'll leave it at that. We can move on
Yeah,
to maybe other kinds of skepticism if you want to talk about not subjectivism or relativism to give
yeah,
some
and just to
whatever you want to do there.
to
Yeah.
kind of clarify a little bit too, the is kind of what you're saying is a little bit is that it does disagreement entail that there's no right answer, and it seems to be the case that you can have disagreement and it's totally compatible with that. There's still an answer, or and in other areas of inquiry, there is disagreement all the time, but that doesn't mean there's not an answer or a right answer, or that we shouldn't be that we're not striving to find that answer. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
um,
good. Yeah, yeah. If I
yeah.
could just jump in there, so what I just said about error is a little bit different than disagreement.
Okay.
Although I think the strategy for response to both is similar. So an argument from disagreement that you mentioned is, I think that's one of the most common arguments to get both subjectivism going. Individuals disagree. That's empirically obvious.
Mhm.
Uh, if a morality was objective, that would rule out disagreement between individuals, and then that just gets kind of repackaged for cultures. Cultures clearly disagree about. I was seeing something in the news this week about a law in, I think it's in India, where it has to do with, like, if you marry, let's see if I can get this right. If you I think it's if you marry outside of your religion, or intermarriage of some kind is illegal now, and like it's pretty severe, the consequences if you're caught in this. And so, well, other countries are looking at this and going, dude, that's just out of control, right? That's not okay. But they have a rationale for it. Okay, so people go, look, there's moral disagreement across cultures. That's obvious. That we have this disagreement is enough to rule it out. Now, your response, I think, is the common strategy to both the subjectivist and the relativist, and say, well, wait a second. Sure, we can have disagreement, but why think that gives us a sufficient evidence to say that there isn't a moral fact of the matter, and that just one party to the disagreement is mistaken. Now, we may not currently know who that is, or we might know who that is,
Hmm.
but what we really need here and can have is that there's a moral order that all groups are trying to get to, and that's what we need to aspire to, precisely to I don't know, in this case, protect marriages or women or men or whatever you want to say, and you need objectivism for that, and that actually holds more
Hmm.
not only sort of rational significance but practical significance. If there's a truth of the matter here, I mean, people's lives and well-being are at stake, and skepticism can't adequately give us that um, sort of basis for, let's say, human thriving and
Hmm.
relational thriving
Hmm.
uh, without objectivism. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think disagreement's the most common argument, but I think your strategy of response is a strong one, and the most common one.
Yeah. And so there's two points that have occurred. One is a pushback against skepticism, and kind of one that's for skepticism. So the first one is kind
Sure,
of
yeah,
like with disagreement. There's one thing. It's like, are they really disagreeing about something, right? So
yeah, good.
if me and my wife, if subjectivism is true, or if nihilism is true, or emotivism is true, whatever the case may be, if the skeptic is right, when me and my wife have a moral disagreement about what we should and should not do, something about parenting, whatever the case may be, are we really disagreeing? Because as so long as we are kind of act truthfully or honestly reflecting our psychological states or emotions, then I'm not wrong and she's not wrong. But it seems to be the case that we actually are disagreeing, and if we really are disagreeing, that's actually kind of I would say like prima facie evidence, right, for kind of some type of objectivism. Um, and so that's kind of one point I want to say was going to make. The other one is
Yeah, I
that
like that. No,
yeah,
go ahead. I'm sorry. I like that.
what I
I
was going
think
to
that's an interesting point.
yeah, and so the second one is so I want to get both your thoughts on this, but the second one is also for the skeptic saying, okay, yeah, so what? Yeah, we don't have the foundation. This is just kind of the way the world is. This is just how it works. But at the end of the day, we are still here. We're still having to share space. So it's better to kind of have, I think, I don't know who the philosopher is, but kind of have like this quasi-realism kind of view to where it's like, okay, yeah, it's really not there, but we're still having to share space. We still need to navigate this world, and it's still better to that we cooperate than we rather not cooperate. And that's
Yeah.
something I feel like that's something a skeptic might say, or the moral skeptic might kind of push back on a little bit.
Yeah, so let me start with that one and maybe work my way back. I think that's that last point you made about like this real pragmatic point, right? Well, practically speaking, we got to get along, right? As a species, we organize. We're social beings. We have to, in order to organize and not die off, we have to have some basic, you know, restrictions on human behavior. And so I think this is one of the stronger, if I to be charitable, stronger ways to be a relativist, or maybe stronger motivations. Relative, skepticism maybe of the relativist variety is true. Why do we have morality? What's its ultimate basis? Culture. Why? Well, just because we got to have something. Because, and maybe some evolutionary thinking bleeds into this sort of account, where it's like we we value surviving as a species. We don't want to go extinct, and so we got to have some basic standards of human behavior. Otherwise, our demise is pretty sure. And so I get that. I can see why a person would say that. And I think if you think about certain social political philosophers like Hobbes, right, and or other kind of contractarian thinking, where I think you can make a case that some social contract ethics is basically, not all of it, but it has this kind of thing in mind. Well, we got to have a contract because, without it, we all lose. And we end up devolving into this state of nature, as Hobbes said. And it's just chaos and destruction. And we don't want that. And so, since we don't want that, we give some power to, Leviathan or whatever, and we agree on a social contract. That's not because the contract is picking out any objective something of the way the world is outside of us, but just because we have to have something. And I think there's, that's not my view, but I think I can see why someone would be attracted to that, um, because they're at least acknowledging a place for something like we call what we call morality. I think another reason it's attractive to people is it also gives us as humans more power over the moral domain, to change it at will or by consensus, maybe in a democratic way, even by vote or something. Um, and we could debate whether that's the right way to go at it. But I think I'm just trying to be fair here of why someone I think might um, be attracted to that. Now, if I can push back on that, I think the non-relativists, right, would say, well, great, yes, I'm glad you don't want to just be an anarchist and let this thing just kind of everyone for themselves. But at the end of the day, one real big downside to um, sort of just constructing morality as a culture and changing it at will is we have lots of historical evidence in human history, right, where whole cultures can be practicing things by agreement that is really bad for some significant contingent within that group, or for some other group outside of their group, like in the case of Hitler and the Jews. Uh, but we could cite examples like women, in the treatment of women historically, and the low view, and even I think in many ways, even in the West, we're still kind of rightly trying to get the rights of women, get it right, and this sort of the place of women in society. And so I think one common something I'm attracted to here is that consensus, while something to be valued in some sense, isn't can't do all the work. The consensus can be wrong. The consensus can be mistaken, and so we need something that's independent of group agreement, right? That that's a checks and balances, as it were, to our our group agreement, right? To hold us accountable, so to speak. And so objectivists are going to say, and of course, there's lots of ways to go here. It could be either human nature is that, or God is that, or uh, if you're a Platonist of some kind, maybe sort of moral reality as it is. And so I think non-relativists are going to welcome the relativists on this sort of pragmatic level, but say we have more to offer you in terms of the long-term goals we have, shared goals we have for human development and human flourishing, than just we got to have something. We want to do better than that. That's sort of a low bar, right? We want something more than that. So, and objectivism can give us something more than that. We can move from just sort of surviving to really thriving as a species. And thriving is where we're really kind of fully alive or becoming more alive, and maxing out or tapping into our creative and um, uh, good capacities as humans to really make human beings, improve human beings and human relationship.
Yeah. And then, and did you want to touch upon, my wife and I aren't really disagreeing. I think you had a point towards that, or do you?
Oh yeah, I like what you said. I think the way I would say your point, which I again, and this is maybe just how I think about it, and so I don't think it's a better way to say it or necessarily, but I think what I hear you saying, if I'm correct, the disagreement itself implies or indicates, points that there's something in reality we're disagreeing about that isn't just in your head or my head or in your head or your wife's head. It really is something out there, so to speak, right? I'm glad to hear that my wife and I aren't the only ones that experience this. So, every relationship has conflict and
Mhm.
disagreement, and you're talking about the good of your children. Your own personalities and upbringings are going to come into play of what you think is best. But it's precisely because there's this objective fact of the well-being of our children that's at stake here,
Mhm.
that the disagreement is about, and it's not a disagreement about our own internal stuff. Sure, that figures in, but that's not all that can be said. It's really about something outside of that.
Mhm.
And for our case, it's these two little lives that we think are precious, and the preciousness isn't because I think it's precious or she thinks it's precious, because it's there, right, in and of itself. And the disagreement is really pointing to that,
Hmm.
and that's what's at stake. And so I think you're right there that
Hmm.
disagreement actually, oddly enough, is a pointer to moral reality.
Hmm.
Not it doesn't take away from it. So
Yes.
I like that.
And that concludes the end of part one of our discussion about ethics. In part two, Dr. Bogosian and I speak about divine command theory as a way philosophers have tried to answer how morals can be objective. If you find value in this content, please consider liking, subscribing, rating, and reviewing the podcast as it shows your support, and I would greatly appreciate it. See you next time.